ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this lecture series on the thought of Jean Piaget as it relates to education. I've structured this talk so that the first part of it will give you a good overview of why Piaget is so important in education, what we can learn from him, and how his ideas can help us be better teachers. I'll try my best to make sure we get through this stuff as clearly as possible, since I imagine it's what is most important to you. But afterwards, I want to segment off some time for those of you who are hungry for more depth of engagement and understanding, and who wish to dig more deeply into some of the things that are problematic in Piaget's work, and in the Constructivist movement in education in general. To begin then, Jean Piaget lived from 1896 up to 1980. He was a Swiss developmental psychologist, most famous for his work with children and his theory of cognitive development, which we will explore shortly. He's also always associated with the trend in education known as Constructivism, even though, as far as I know, Piaget never called himself a constructivist. Constructivism is the most prominent idea that underpins teacher education nowadays, ladies and gentlemen. Probably most of the folks who teach you at university in your B.Ed program are self-proclaimed constructivists. So really, inasmuch as constructivism has its taproot in Piaget's work, we certainly owe much of our own understanding today of schools, education, teaching, learning, to Piaget. I'd say Piaget and Dewey remain the big shooters in education these days, in fact, and I imagine that in your B.Ed program, these two authors receive the most attention, inasmuch as so-called philosophers of education are even being taught anymore at your institutions. Okay, so what's so great about Piaget anyway? Well, if nothing else, it is that Piaget took great efforts to see the children he was studying, to really see them and understand them. What are their thoughts? How do they make sense of the world? What sorts of ways of thinking and understanding are typical of infants, of toddlers, of younger and older children? Do they change or develop in their attitudes and understandings? Is there a natural progression to their development? Or are they really just whatever we tell them to be? I think Piaget can help us see past many of the misconceptions that have plagued education, where perhaps we've had a tendency to take the manner in which the system runs and the methods of the system as sacrosanct, and where perhaps in the past we've just expected the kids we teach to fit that system, rather than rethinking our systems of education so that they better respond to the needs of the kids. So, lots and lots of things besides learning drive education, right? There's government agendas, there's ideology, economics, social mores, public opinion, the fears and desires and expectations, as well as misunderstandings of parents. So many balls are being juggled in the air at the same time that it's a wonder how anyone gets a decent education. And teachers have a very important job, and they're in some ways miracle workers in the midst of all these competing demands and interests. Piaget's developmentalism can help us identify some of the problems in what has come to be known as the factory model of education. That's where kids are treated kind of like widgets on an assembly line. And as they move down the line, us teachers gotta add stuff to them, component parts. And it's we who determine what gets added, when, and where, and how. The process has little to do with kids or considerations of their nature or what's suited to them developmentally. They are or will be whatever we tell them they should be through education. We make them in our own image and according to our own specifications, eh? That's the factory model. Or you might think in terms of the banking model of education, which you've probably encountered already somewhere if you've been reading from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a book that was or is considered to be a requisite text in most Piaget programs these days. For those of you who haven't heard of the banking model, just think of it like this. We, the teachers, are the bankers. We're the guys with all the money or funds of knowledge. We've got all the power, right? And the kids, our students, are just like little receptacles for our funds. They're like empty vessels or bank accounts into which we make our deposits. We fill the kids up with knowledge, according to this metaphor. We, the teachers, have all the power. We control who gets taught, what gets taught, and who has power in this situation, namely ourselves. Because we're the founts of knowledge. And the kids, who form a kind of underclass in Freire's view, who's Marxist, by the way, well, the kids are made servile towards and reliant upon those with all the power, namely us. They never learn how to see or how to learn for themselves. They're held down by the man. They're never given the keys to learning or encouraged to inquire after their own questions. Rather, they're made obedient and kept obedient by dominant educational power structures. Following this banking model, like with the factory model, you can see that their nature is pretty sadly overlooked and malnourished in many ways. So, Piaget came along at a time when these sorts of assumptions generally undergirded mass education systems. He's a developmentalist, which means that he doesn't think kids are infinitely malleable according to our will, our desires and whims, or what we'd like to see in a workforce. They're not at all like little machines or widgets or deposit boxes that we can just mold or build or fill whenever and however we like. Nope. They have a kind of organic nature to them. They naturally develop in certain ways that you shouldn't screw with, at a certain pace that you must respect, and they move through stages of development that ought to be recognized. So, if we want to be good teachers who really see the kids in front of us, we have to stop seeing only that image or model of kids that we've taken for granted as truth in the factory model, say, or that's rendered by Freire in his critique of the banking model. These basic images of what kids are lie to us, ladies and gentlemen, and Piaget is very careful to point out those lies. See, he was a very fine psychologist with a great respect for observation and scientific method. He really wanted to understand kids. He really wanted to see them. And so, he designed a multitude of experiments, and he conducted so many studies where he watched and interviewed kids, all with a view to coming to know them and what makes them tick. So understand that Piaget's ideas about child development are all well-researched and well-grounded in data derived from replicable studies. And what he found was that kids do in fact develop, and that their development has a kind of progression to it, and that their development follows a natural maturation process. So when we teach kids, we should be aware of how they develop, at what stages, generally speaking, they grow and develop this or that capacity. or way of understanding what sorts of things are cognitively appropriate for them in one age range, but maybe detrimental or counterproductive at another age range, and so forth. Understanding Piaget, holding his insights in the back of our minds as we teach, will help us be wary of those tendencies that exist in educational systems that still suppose kids are more like widgets or bank accounts. Piaget offers us a more organic, growth-related metaphor for what we're doing when we're teaching and when our students are learning. Oh, and by the way, don't be fooled into supposing that Piaget discovered all this stuff about child development, folks. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. There's this tendency in B.Ed programs to suppose that prior to Dewey, school was some kind of wasteland, that everything worthwhile knowing in education is post-Dewey. And now, it's even worse, I think. Now, the move is on to make all of our teaching in schools research-based, which means essentially that the only stuff we're supposed to be doing as teachers is the stuff we're told has been tested and verified by academics and researchers who've published articles on the cutting edge. This rhetoric of the research-based approach to pedagogy is hard to combat, too. After all, who would possibly disagree that research is a good thing, eh? And if you furrow your brow about it, or voice hesitations about it, you sound like a backward stick in the mud and an impediment to progress. But be aware that this new trend over the past 5 or 10 years towards research-based education also means less autonomy for you and I as teachers, as well as less respect for the tried and true methods of the classroom. Forget about tradition and common sense. Forget about teacher experience. Forget even about experimenting or trying things that we don't know if they'll work or not. Rely only upon the experts. Rely on what has been proven social scientifically in academic publications. And if you're not hip to these new trends as they arise, don't worry. Your bosses in the school board, your administrators at your school, these folks will inform you. I think we're easily swept up by what is seen as novel and innovative as educators. We scoff at what is very old unless it's repackaged as new. We're enamored of our modern image, ladies and gentlemen, so full of ourselves, and bullocks to everything that doesn't look like us, or that didn't spring up in the last 10 years. So let's not be so dismissive of the past, of the great traditions of the past, and of the fine thinkers from the past, eh? For instance, this Piagetian idea of developmentalism in children and in education predates Piaget by a huge stretch, actually. Any of you who have read Rousseau's Emile will see aspects of it there as clear as day. And even though Locke is nowadays much maligned as the guy who ostensibly told us that kids are empty vessels and that education is all about treating the child's mind as a, quote, blank slate, which he didn't really. Locke, too, was intimately aware of how kids of different ages are at different developmental stages, and therefore we need to teach them differently. You can also find similar insights during the Middle Ages in the writings of men like Moses Maimonides, or even further back into ancient times. Indeed, the idea that there was a kind of progression in learning that is suited not only to subject matters but also to learners is attested even in Pythagorean ideas of education, where the quadrivium of subjects has its earliest roots. So, just take this as a warning and a reminder not to carry with you that dismissive arrogance that seems to underlie all things modern. Okay. I hope I've introduced the basics of Piagetian developmentalism here to you easily enough. Now, what are these overall stages through which Piaget sees all kids moving developmentally? Well, Piaget isolates 4 major stages that span infancy, childhood, and adolescence. These 4, in order, are number 1, the sensoromotor stage, which occurs from birth to age 2, thereabouts. During this period, kids learn all about the world around them, primarily through their senses. Like, for example, look at how kids at this age are always picking everything up and putting it in their mouth, right? Second, the pre-operational stage, which Piaget says occurs from ages 2 to 7, roughly. During this time, kids are acquiring their basic motor skills. Their learning is characterized by what he calls centration. Basically, intensive focusing of the attention on one activity or one thing or one aspect in a situation. Actually, if you'd like to learn more about this, my advice to you is to read Maria Montessori's work. She's made the study, the respect for, and the development of this wonderful capacity for attentiveness among children the focus of much of her own life's work. Also, during this pre-operational stage, Piaget speaks about the arising of a child's intuitive thought, which he says occurs when a child is able to believe in something without knowing why she or he believes it. Beyond this, children at this stage are held by Piaget to be highly egocentric. That is to say, they demonstrate a tendency to only think from one point of view about things. Okay, those are the first 2 stages. The third is the concrete operational stage, which occurs from ages 7 to 11, thereabouts. As you can guess, it's during this age range that kids move away from picking things up and putting them in their mouths to know them and slide more towards the use of logic to think about concrete events. When you want to teach kids this age, the story goes, keep whatever it is you're teaching them concrete and visible and tactile. Use lots of examples and hands-on manipulatives. Kids at this age, the story goes, don't do so well with abstract, theoretical, or conceptual reasoning. So, the suggestion implicit here is maybe wait till they're developmentally prepared for that sort of thing. And then the fourth is called the formal operational stage, which occurs after age 11. This is when so-called abstract reasoning starts to develop. Okay? So you can see then how this basic developmental structure that Piaget spied out in all of his psychological experiments can help us tailor our classroom approaches to teaching the kids we have before us, generally speaking, according to their age range and cognitive stages. I can't remember when I heard the story, but I recall someone once telling me about Piaget when his work first started to shake things up in education circles. He was traveling around Europe, and everywhere he went, teachers were really interested in learning from him how to tweak their own pedagogical practices so that they took greater care to abide in and respond to the natural developmental processes exhibited by children as they learn. Everywhere in Europe, so the story goes, folks came to hear him speak, and they left from his lectures with a better grasp of how to adjust their approach to the needs of the children they were teaching, to see them better for who they are, and to have their pedagogy respond accordingly. But when Piaget came to the United States, so the story goes, his audience responded very differently. They too were intensely interested in what Piaget had to say. Not because they wanted to make sure that they weren't teaching in a way that was not respectful of the developmental stages children naturally grow through, but rather because, in Piaget's work, they sought the keys to figuring out how to get the kids reading and writing and doing math and computations at ever earlier stages. So there seems to be something in the North American spirit that, even despite Piaget's best efforts, dismisses such advice about slowing things down, about not rushing ahead, about having patience and being attentive to the developmental stages that are natural to kids, as opposed to treating them like widgets on an assembly line that we can just speed up as we see fit in order to boost productivity and competitive success. This spirit seems to trump even the most careful observations Piaget has made, and it does so still today, when Piaget's insights and his constructivist model of education are taken as foundational in progressive education. And you'll encounter this tension in your schools as teachers, ladies and gentlemen. From time to time, you'll get pushback from parents when your understanding of developmentalism causes you to slow things down. Depending on what school you're in, you'll likely also encounter pressure from administrators and department heads to speed things up, to push ahead, to achieve. Such people are, naturally enough, given to pressures that are exerted on them from above, worried about how kids at their school must be prepared for their exams, even if the expectations that underlie these exams are not developmentally legitimate. I know of parents in my own neighborhood, and in my own children's schools, for instance, who have actually pulled their kids out of the public system because they are offended that their sons and daughters are not receiving homework in kindergarten, for instance. That they are not reading and writing or performing this or that mathematical computation at ever earlier ages. How is my son going to compete in a global market if he can't read by the end of kindergarten? Or if he struggles with math or reading by the end of grade 1? These fears are about their kids not having success in the future, not being far enough ahead of their neighbor, not having the competitive advantage at ever earlier ages. These fears, coupled with a general ignorance about the real nature of education, as well as a complete inattention to the developmental insights of men like Piaget, these fears all conspire to create movements in education like TLCs or traditional learning centers like Back to the Basics pedagogy or Baby Einstein, Baby Mozart. There's a long list of such marketing ploys you can investigate on the internet. It makes me worry for our future. On the one hand, I understand this competitive edge and impatient attitude towards education that's sweeping through parental circles. It's in part motivated not only by parental fears, but also driven by their love for their children and by their wishes to see their children succeed. But on the other hand, these fears, which arise from a deep place of love and concern, like all fears resting upon ignorance and fomented into mass hysteria by the media and marketers and politicians, such fears have many negative consequences. First off, what good does it do to teach in a way that does not reflect the natural capacities of children and that ignores the developmental stages that are given to them naturally as human beings? Do you place your own ideas of success and of what your children should be above seeing who they really are? What happens when we educate with such blinders on? What does this do to our children? they're only young for so short a period of time, and when we fail to see them for who they truly are in childhood, when we don't take care to try to understand their mode of thinking, or the way they understand the world, or the manner in which they learn best given their age, are we really doing them a service by pushing them to perform in ways unsuited to them developmentally? Second, what message are we sending to kids about their relations with one another, eh? When we approach education as survival of the fittest, when we seek ever to speed up accomplishment and performance beyond what is developmentally sound, when we accelerate the pace of our educational expectations, all on the basis of, say, 21st century learning, what does this do? In Canada, back in the old days, our national government had a policy towards First Nations children of assimilation, which, this is no word of a lie, involved killing the Indian within. That's actually what they called it, killing the Indian within, to make way for the formation of the Canadian citizen. This, in hindsight, was a kind of genocidal war. We can all agree that such an approach to killing the child within was a horrible, horrible experiment in social engineering. A real dark chapter in Canadian history, folks. But what about our more elusive and still broadly accepted policy nowadays of getting rid of the child, regardless of his or her race, as soon as possible, and transforming him according to our ideas of what a mature adult should be able to do? How does this desire to eradicate the child within sit with you? And all the pressures on kids to outcompete their neighbors, their friends, and playmates? Don't we seem, in doing so, to teach each child from a place of fear? Do we not imply that their neighbor and playmate is ultimately their enemy, or at very least their competitor, and therefore a threat to their own success and future job prospects? Do we not reinforce acceptance of a kind of Hobbesian myth that human existence is at its core a war of all against all, where the prime motivator is not love for the greatest good or a summum bonum, but rather fear of that summum malum, namely failure or lack of competitive success? Perhaps some of you think I'm being alarmist here, but I think it is a very interesting thing that, at least on the pop culture level, so many teen fiction novels and popular movies lately are all about dystopian future societies where adolescents and children are made by the powers that be, by society at large, or by an adult populace that is self-destructed, to fight one another to the death in competitions for survival. School seems to be very much like that today, ladies and gentlemen. Now, admittedly, these problems are far more complex than simply us having overlooked Piaget's developmental insights. But perhaps Piaget's developmentalism might in some small way give us pause from further exacerbating these societal drives towards ever accelerating our children's educational achievements, all in the name of their success and mastery over others. Perhaps knowing our Piaget might help soothe some of our fears and grant us a bit more patience with children to slow things down just a wee bit. Let's not kill the child within. Rather, let us allow kids to be kids during their childhood. Let's teach them developmentally, out of respect for the natural transpiration of that process. Okay, let's now return for a bit to look more closely at some of Piaget's developmentalist work for what it tells us about the elementary school-aged kids that we may end up teaching. I'd like to direct your attention in particular to his book entitled The Child's Conception of the World. When you read that book, you'll see that the stages or periods he discusses are different than the ones I enumerated just a moment ago. Those stages, remember, traversed infancy, childhood, as well as adolescence. But in the child's conception of the world, Piaget's experiments were restricted to kids between the ages of 5 and 12. So within that age range, you'll note that after he crunches his data, he sometimes talks about having found 3 stages of development, sometimes 4. It seems to depend on the particular questions he's investigating with children in order to figure out how their ideas and their understanding of the world develops as they get older. The big questions that Piaget wants to answer in his book are things like, what conception of the world does the child naturally form at the different stages of his or her development? What is the modality of child thought? And what use does the child make of notions of causality in law? Piaget interviews very many children, and he carefully notes the different sorts of answers they provide to his questions at different ages. And generally, he finds that, quote, the child, like the uncultured adult, appears exclusively concerned with things. He is indifferent to the life of thought, and the originality of original points of view escapes him, unquote. In Piaget's view, the child is mainly concerned with the imitation of what is. Okay, so Piaget's observations and his experimental questioning with children lead him to conclude that children are, on the one hand, highly egocentric, but on the other hand, markedly unconscious of themselves. Now, that may seem like a contradiction on the surface, eh? How can one be egocentric or think the whole world revolves around oneself on the one hand, but lack self-consciousness on the other? What Piaget means is nothing really so contradictory. He's simply stating the fact that we can think everything exists for us, that all the world is responsive to us and our demands, right? And that it ought to be responsive to us, while at the same time not being very reflective about who we really are. Indeed, I'm sure you've not only met many children who exemplify this tendency, but also very many adults as well. Piaget sees this lack of self-knowledge or self-awareness as being the same thing, really, as not being able to see clearly how you are distinct from everything else. How your own life is not the life that might be found in other people or things. How your own feelings and thoughts aren't in everything else. How you are separate and distinct from everything else in some fundamental respects. How you are a subject and everything else is an object. Piaget writes, quote, so long as thought has not become conscious of self, it's a prey to perpetual confusions between objective and subjective, between the real and the ostensible, unquote. Really, I think that much of what Piaget is doing in his research is trying to figure out what boundary a child draws between his or herself and the world as he or she develops or matures. How does that boundary shift over time? And although I don't think Piaget ever states it so clearly, I think we can safely assume from remarks throughout his book that, in his view, the proper, realistic, and accurate way of understanding the world and oneself is that I am a subject. I am distinct from all other people who are subjects too. I have my own private thoughts and feelings, but also other people tend to share many of the same sorts of feelings and thoughts as I do. Moreover, my thoughts and my words aren't in the things around me. They're just symbols and concepts. These words, right, are just symbols and concepts I use to think about these things. And these words have been developed over time by people so that we can think about ourselves and the world. These are some of the things that Piaget takes for granted as the right way to understand ourselves, our language, and the world. But more than that, underlying Piaget's work is also the assumption that the world is not a subject, but properly speaking, only an object. The world doesn't have any true personhood to it. When I relate with the world as a person, that's just me projecting my own inner states upon it. That's me personifying, romancing, or as Piaget says, introjecting my own inner states upon external things. Now, being properly mature, in other words, means divorcing myself from this relational life with all that is. As a growing, maturing, developing human being, I am called upon to divest myself of this childish notion that we are all one, and that everything is one in some deep, fundamental sense. In order to grow up, I must stop romancing. I must eventually eradicate from my understanding any notion that the world is alive or be sold, that non-animal life forms have consciousness, or that animal life forms ratiocinate as I do. In other words, to be properly grown up and reasonable, I must eschew all my associations with what Piaget calls animism, a view that he deems crudely romantic, primitive, and uncultured, but that also underlies much religious and mythological tradition. Say, for instance, if we look at Aboriginal peoples with respect to Mother Earth, Japanese Shinto and their veneration of kami, or nature spirits, or at the ancient Greeks, for whom the world was alive with gods. But animism and romancing is not all that we must overcome as we move out of childhood, ladies and gentlemen. According to Piaget, we must furthermore cast aside the notion that all things participate in all other things as part of a grand cosmic order, what the ancient Greeks, Plato in particular, called methexis, and an idea that Piaget finds most pernicious, as well as what Piaget refers to as artificialism, or the feeling that all things are somehow made like they're an artifice, right? They're made by a transcendent creator or creative force, whether that be the first men, say, or nature, or God. All of these ways of interacting in the world and of understanding the world, Piaget finds to be aspects of a child's immaturity. They're all examples of a child's romancing, and as such, they are things that must be sloughed off as so much delusion as he or she develops, grows, and progresses. Now, let me be clear at this point. Such romantic delusions and confusions are deemed natural and appropriate to children at this or that age or stage in their development. So in Piaget's view, these ways of being in the world only become backward if they're persisted in beyond their allocated developmental time frame. In his view, such so-called romantic views of themselves and of the world eventually collapse, wither, and die out successfully as a child becomes more self-aware and self-conscious. The development of true self-knowledge involves, in Piaget's view, becoming aware of our own subjectivity. That is, each of us, in coming to know ourselves, begins to recognize the personal quality of our own desires, inclinations, affections, and so forth. Such self-awareness or self-consciousness is, in Piaget's view, the true indicator that a child has developed a better understanding of the way things are, and his awareness of subjectivity grows through, as Piaget says, quote, a series of disillusions and through being contradicted by others, unquote. Generally, this growth in self-awareness takes place after the ages of 7 or 8 in Piaget's view, but it's also dependent upon social factors and contact with others in discussion. Now, to be fair, there are tensions in Piaget's work with regard to his judgments regarding the self-understanding of children and their conception of the world. For instance, on the one hand, Piaget wants to distance himself from accusations that he actually has a position on the legitimacy of what he refers to as animism. Perhaps because he's aware that kids aren't the only people in the world who interact with the world as person rather than as an object, and that there are vast cultural, religious, mythical, and philosophic traditions that cultivate such understandings. However, Piaget's attempts at distancing himself from such negative judgments ring rather hollow when we simply read through his work, where time and time again he does criticize the child's attitude toward the world as being inaccurate. Moreover, his entire developmentalist framework presupposes a kind of progress from what he calls the crude efforts of a child at introspection towards an adult consciousness of subjectivity. Be that as it may, we should remember that Piaget isn't therefore telling us that it's our job as educators to go out there and destroy a child's fancies, or to divest him of his delusions about the world. No, it seems pretty clear when we read Piaget that the views and conceptions of children at this or that age must be respected, that they're wholly appropriate for children at this or that stage of development, that we mustn't uproot them, tear them up as errors, right? Or rush kids into growing up. Let kids be kids, to put things simply. But that doesn't mean that we should just sit back and not challenge kids either. Part of what we're doing as teachers is organizing learning experiences for kids in which they can encounter and develop a growing sense of their own subjectivity. Again, Piaget says this happens through experiences that bring about the disillusionment of children. That is, through experiences that don't seem to jibe at all with some of their earlier suppositions about how the world works, how they work, and their relation or perhaps disjunction between their own thoughts and feelings about the world and the world itself. Setting up experiences that perturb or create disequilibrium for kids is, in short, the bee's knees of teaching developmentally and constructively, a la Piaget. Teaching with child development in mind, therefore, involves providing not just for experiences of perplexity, but also ensuring that there's lots of opportunity for kids to discuss and to dialogue about experiences and understandings. This is why other developmental psychologists, like Janet Astington in her book, The Child's Discovery of the Mind, Even though she takes issue with certain aspects of Piaget's findings concerning the content of each stage, as well as some of his distinctions about when precisely the stages of childhood start or stop, she nonetheless agrees with him that kids learn to know themselves and they come into self-knowledge and self-awareness most effectively through practicing metacognition, reflection, or thinking about thinking. Kids need to metacognize. They're never too young for it. And in her view, the more work we can do as teachers with kids that involves metacognition, the better. Case closed. Now, let's jump back a bit to examine more carefully the framework of conceptual development that Piaget identifies among children between the ages of 5 and 12. Again, depending on what question he's pursuing, the stages he identifies shift up or down in age slightly. Sometimes he finds 3 stages, sometimes 4. But generally, we see that at the ages of 5 to 6, kids suppose that all thinking is done with the mouth or the voice. Thought, says Piaget, is confused at this age with the things thought about. Nothing is understood to be subjective. Moreover, kids see names as belonging to things and actually emanating from them. Names are in things. Piaget calls this belief nominal realism, where there is no distinction between a thought and its object, or where the name is included in the nature of the thing it names. See? The mind and the thing are assumed to be one at this stage. So Piaget says children at this age confuse their own self with the world. And not only that, all things are held to have a consciousness of a kind. And everything is considered to be alive that has an activity, a function, or a use. Now that's during the earliest stage. However, when children develop a little, say at the ages of 7 and 8, their ideas about the world, about thinking, and our use of words to think, basically their self-understanding and their conceptions and of the boundaries between themselves and the world around them, all these things change. Ages of 7 and 8. Adult influence is thought to have much to do with this change. Kids at this age hear what adults say about things, and they adopt those views too. Hence, thinking is now considered not to be with the mouth or the voice, but rather with the head, or the brain, right? Children continue to, as Piaget puts it, materialize thinking, calling its nature akin to the air, or something in one's blood. That's what thinking is. Or they say thinking is like a ball. At this age, they begin better to understand logical problems, but they can't solve them systematically yet. And although they no longer seem generally to suppose that names emanate from the things themselves, children at this age, or at this stage, now attribute the origin of names to God or to the first men. Names not being in the objects to which they refer, they're now considered to be either nowhere or everywhere. Regardless, names and words are still felt to have a kind of harmony with the thing, or with the idea of the thing that is named by them. Similarly, the child's conceptions of life and consciousness also begin to shift. No longer is everything alive or conscious. Life is restricted to whatever can move. And then, soon after that, to self-movers, which is, after all, the original root meaning of our word soul.
things that can move of their own accord, moreover, are held to have consciousness. And whereas at the earlier stage of 5 or 6, the self and things were completely confused with one another, says Piaget, at this stage, the self begins to be differentiated from all else. Except that the subjective aspects of the self, say our thoughts and our desires and fears, for instance, these things are still held to adhere in other things, right? They're somehow there. They're somehow present in other things as well. Okay, so after these first 2 stages, or sometimes 3, comes the final stage, around the age of 11 or 12, or sometimes 10. During this developmental period, Piaget contends that thought is no longer materialized, but rather understood as something wholly immaterial. Children no longer see names as being in things, nor do they seem to locate the origin of names in God or the first men anymore. Rather, they suppose that names and words are simply conventions developed over a vast period of time and used by their ancestors to talk and think about things. Names contain nothing in and of themselves. They're purely signs. Where at the earliest stage, children are said to confuse their own self and the world indistinctly, and to suppose that the mind and its thoughts and its thought objects are one. At this final stage, thoughts are situated not in things outside of ourselves, but only within our own minds. Moreover, children at the ages of 11 or 12 are able to see that there's more than one way to look at and to understand a thing, that their own thoughts are therefore only a particular point of view. Similarly, the child's propensity for animism is observed to die at this stage. Consciousness is restricted solely to animals and humans, whereas life is restricted to animals, humans, and plants, period. And that's the basics of Piaget's stages and of how kids generally develop their conceptions about the world and themselves. Again, since Piaget's day, other developmental psychologists, they've come along to dispute a number of his distinctions and contentions. One such researcher that I like is Janet Astington. As I mentioned earlier, in her book, The Child's Discovery of the Mind, she focuses on kids even younger than 5, mostly between the ages of 2 and 5, in fact. She provides a fair bit of research to show that even at these younger ages, children begin to discover the mind. That not only is the mind somehow composed of mental states, but that it's also somehow a creator of mental states. That in itself is a very strange and perplexing contradictory thing that unfortunately she skips over in her own scholarship, but I digress. The developmentalist point I would draw your attention to here is that Astington seems far less convinced than Piaget that even the youngest children don't know the difference between you and I and themselves and things. She points to evidence that infants know about such things, for instance, that they can and do discern the intentions of others, that an 18-month-year-old children, well, they can detect differences between what is real and make-believe, that 2-year-olds can know and talk about the causes and consequences of thoughts and feelings. In short, it seems that maybe Piaget didn't look hard enough, or was too rigid in his interpretations of his findings when he was forging his ideas concerning the stages of childhood. Of particular note in Astington's research is what she sees as a big change between 3 and 4-year-old kids. Younger than the age of 4, thinking and knowing mean quite different things to children than they do to adults. Prior to the age of 4, she finds that children don't recognize false beliefs in others or in themselves. At the age of 4, however, they acquire what she calls a representational theory of mind. Let me quote Astington here to give you a better sense of what this phrase means. She writes, quote, An important development occurs when children discover what the mind does, when they understand representational activity. 3-year-olds understand the difference between thought and things. They understand that thoughts are unseen states. However, at this stage, children see the relation between these mental entities and the world as direct, unquote. And she goes on to speak about what happens when kids hit the age of 4. Here's what she says. A new theory is formed in which people do act to fulfill their desires, but in light of their beliefs. Minds are not seen as directly connected to the world. Rather, the relation between the mind and the world is mediated by representation. Thus, children come to understand that people's thoughts are representations constructed by the mind, unquote. In other words, at the age of 4, kids begin to understand that our representations or thoughts about the world can be wrong. So, it seems that Astington finds an incredible breakthrough in the discovery of the mind among children at the age of 4, where Piaget seems only to find a hopelessly muddled, romantic, animistic viewpoint that's insufficiently aware of the so-called truth of our human subjectivity. And so it goes. Okay, one final thing I'd like to talk about in this first half of our lecture series on Jean Piaget's thought. And that concerns his status as one of the fathers of Constructivism. As I mentioned earlier, nowadays if you want to be a teacher, and if you're learning to be a teacher in a B.Ed program, pretty much everyone there will say they're some kind of constructivist. Put in simple terms, constructivism is the belief that the mind is active in the construction of knowledge. What that means is that human beings don't find or discover the truth about the world or themselves. They're not uncovering something about reality that has always been there. Rather, they're making the truth. They're constructing it. They're building concepts and systems of thought designed to make sense of their experiences. And they're continually testing and modifying these systems and concepts in light of new experiences that cause the old concepts and systems not to work so well anymore. Nowadays, folks in academia call constructivism a form of coherence theory. Talk about coherence theories is all the rage today, and most often coherence theories are juxtaposed or contrasted with what are called correspondence theories of learning. As educators, we're supposed to go, yay, to coherence theories, and boo to correspondence theories. The idea nowadays is that if you espouse any vestige of a correspondence theory, you're going to be a bad teacher. Good teachers accept coherence theories as their own personal savior. So what is a coherence theory? And what is a correspondence theory? And how is Piagetian constructivism an example of a yay coherence theory? Let me briefly explain before ending this half of our investigation of Piaget's writings. If you harbor a boo, correspondence theory of learning in your heart, that means you suppose that whatever a person thinks, in order for it to be true, must jibe or correspond with actual reality. Our ideas about things must match or render truthfully the reality about which they are ideas, see? That makes our learning very much a form of discovery, doesn't it? Well, yay! A coherence theory, on the other hand, doesn't look for such a correspondence between our ideas or our thoughts and the reality of which we're thinking. Rather, according to coherence theory, there is nothing for us to discover. Our minds don't touch and do not apprehend what is. Knowing is rather the construction of truth, and truth is relative. It is systematic coherence. That is to say, something is, so to speak, true because in the system we've constructed to make sense of our experiences, everything hangs together or coheres. There is internal consistency to our system of ideas or our valuations. And this happy state of affairs remains in place as a kind of equilibrium until we have an experience that renders the system problematic, that destroys or just jeopardizes the system's internal consistency, and therefore that makes us no longer able to rest on our laurels in the happy pretense that we know something perfectly well. Now, we must work hard to investigate and to reconstruct our own subjective system of knowledge so that we might once again reestablish its internal coherence. Coherence theory, isn't that so much better? And now, too, you can see how Piagetian constructivism works as a kind of coherence theory, right? Learning for the constructivist is the constant revisioning, or revisioning, I guess, yeah, I said that right, and updating of our own respective systems of knowing as individuals. Right? We're constantly updating. And knowers are always right, or at least always justified in their interpretations, since we can't say that they're in error, because that would imply a correspondence theory of knowing, correct? You can't be wrong about something unless you're looking and saying that doesn't match with reality, but we can't do that unless we're correspondence theorists, see? Hence, kids should be allowed to develop naturally. Let them be. Don't demand that a little kid have the correct grown-up answers to things. Let them develop their understanding as kids need to develop them. At such and such a stage, let them live within their coherent, internally consistent worldview. It's appropriate for them. It's appropriate because it's the way they make sense of the world and of themselves. But as their teacher, be sure to provide them with novel experiences that disrupt, perturb, and challenge those constructed systems of meanings that the kids have and that they've constructed, right? They've developed these things. And then, as the kids move inquisitively to respond to these perturbations, as they readjust, they grow. And they construct viable, as opposed to valid or true systems of meaning. Children are, following Piaget's constructivist approach, not deficient human beings. All human beings, no matter their age, have adequate understanding for their particular situated or immediate circumstances. The aim of education, at least from a constructivist point of view, is not to complete human beings, but rather to provide them with experiences that challenge their constructions, and that in turn bring about expansions and adjustments in the system of meaning they themselves construct. Where Vygotskian psychology supposes this process to transpire through dialogue and in cooperative learning environments, and his brand of education is therefore known as social constructivism, Piaget's constructivism focuses more so upon the individualized child rather than the notion of knowledge construction in so-called learning communities. Okay, let's abruptly end this foray into Piaget's ideas as they relate to education. If you can stomach it, and if you're so inclined to care, the second half of this lecture will take Piaget and his associations with constructivism and coherence theory to task. Even though there's much good in Piaget, I submit to you that there's also much that's rotten and diluted. See you next time. Thanks for listening.